Hello and welcome to our next session of National and International Affairs. I am Parvez Khan. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Kuhat University of Science and Technology. The course code is GMC 341, it's lecture 17, which is the end of bipolar world and its implications. So we'll be talking about the bipolar world, what bipolar world was, how the world changed after it ended. So before going into detail, we'll talk about the objectives of the session first. Students will be able to understand the difference between unipolar and bipolar world. Students will develop an understanding of how polarity works in the face of global politics. And students will be engaged in a debate whether or not today's world is unipolar. So we're going to talk about polarity, unipolar and bipolar world. So it's important to understand how the global power shifted. If there's what's the meaning of unipolar, so let's see what unipolarity means. Unipolarity in international politics is a distribution of power in which one state exercises most of the cultural, economic, and military influence. So we have to see whether there's one superpower at the moment. Are they dominating in cultural, economic, and military terms? So if that's happening today, it's a unipolar world. And opposite to that, bipolarity can be defined as a system of world order in which the majority of global economic, military, and cultural influence is held between two states. And the classic case of bipolar world is that of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which dominated the second half of the 20th century. So this is what bipolarity is, and we need to go into a bit of history. So, in simple terms, let's come again. If it's a one economic, military, or hegemonic power that is dominating the world culturally, economically, that is we call unipolar world. But if two powers exist at the same time, that's bipolar. And since we often call the fall of Berlin Wall and the end of Soviet Empire as the end of bipolarity, but it's important to look at the history as well. So the end of the Second World War did not signal a return to normalcy. On the contrary, it resulted in a new conflict. When the World War II ended, a new conflict came out. The major European powers that had been at the forefront of the international stage in 1930s were left exhausted and ruined by war, which set the scene for the emergence of two new global superpowers. So right after the World War II, two new global superpowers came to the scene, and two blocs developed around the Soviet Union and the United States, with other countries being forced to choose between the two camps. So what we can see that two countries emerged, powerful countries in terms of technology, weapons. Both these countries advanced themselves to the mega level, even in nuclear technology, even in space technology. A race began, and countries were asked to join either of the two camps. The world was divided into two camps. And it was also an economic war or military war, you can call it, but majorly it was an ideological war. It was the communism versus capitalism. Both had a complete contrasting systems, and that's why Soviet Union, when they dominated in the European regions, they brought up system which was completely changed in contrast to capitalism. Now let's talk about the Cold War. The conflicts of interest between the new world powers gradually multiplied, and a climate of fear and suspicion reigned. What we saw is that the interest between the two world powers multiplied. They started looking and analyzing each other's strengths and weaknesses, and that created a climate of fear and suspicion. And it's very interesting if you can see Cuba Missile Crisis, how everything escalated. There was a chances for a third world war. You can look into that as well. But let's talk about more of it. Like each country feared the newfound power of the other. The Soviets felt surrounded and threatened by the West and accused the United States of spearheading imperialist expansion. Soviet Union was worried of the imperialist designs of United States, and it had its own fears. But on the contrary, even the Americans were concerned that the communist expansion was taking place, and Stalin was accused of breaching certain agreements on the rights of free people. So that's how it began. But things started to change with the collapse of Soviet Union, and the time period from 1989 to 1991, world witnessed a change. The end of Cold War and subsequent collapse of Soviet Union marked the dramatic change in world politics. And mind you, in this context, the role of Pakistan is also very important. Soviet Union, since its communist ideology, it believed in its expansionist designs. It invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and the decades of war fueled energies. It brought an economic crisis, and since Pakistan too was part of the U.S. allies, Pakistan participated in the war covertly, and they tried to put off the upcoming communist forces advancing towards Pakistan and even in Afghanistan. And that's how the rise of different groups and the Northern Alliance, the Taliban, and all these groups came into existence in Afghanistan, fighting against the Soviet troops, and later for the dominancy of Afghanistan by each group in how they operated and the military strength. So Afghanistan also has a key role in the collapse of Soviet Union, and Pakistan indirectly was part of the U.S. ally groups which was fighting the Soviet Union. So it's all a global game. Pakistan had its very strong ties with United States. Instead of going for the Russian camp, Pakistan opted for United States since the early days of Pakistan's independence. So this is a bit of history that we talked about. But obviously, the collapse of Soviet Union, they were down. That brought the end to the bipolarity. The world once again was looking forward to a unipolar world. Obviously, the term multipolarity is also counted often, but it's more importantly to look into it from a different perspective as well. So, from a strategic standpoint, the United States' status as a unipolar superpower remains as strong as ever in the recent times. And United States leads and promotes strategic relations with Japan, France, Germany, and India. Its smart diplomacy strategy has outmaneuvered China's policy of non-alignment, thus leaving China and Russia with no sufficient strategic allies to change the unipolar international system. So for like 10 years, this was true, 10, 20 years between the 1990 till for 10, 15 years. But China has expanded, and it has expanded tremendously. It poses a greater threat to the unipolarity of the American imperialistic designs. So let's look into it from this context that United States is no longer in its prime position like it was after the Second World War. Due to the economic recession, the demand of people, the waste of blood and resources, and unnecessary wars, things have started to change. And the rise of China and the diffusion of power and technology, China emergence as a superpower can be a normal process for Asia. Asian countries can benefit from China in a number of ways. And Pakistan is one of those countries that's looking forward to continuing the strategic partnership with China. And this is what they're looking forward to. However, the competition and rivalry between great powers in Asia can complicate the emergence of China as a true superpower as well. And that's partly because India and China are the strongest rivals in the Asian context. Both are fighting for the supremacy of economy, and that's why some countries can pose threat to Chinese development. But anyway, the role of China is very important. The initiative taken by China, the Belt and Road Initiative and the CPEC project and all these, is a clear indication that it's emerging as one of the most powerful countries in the world. The GDP growth ratio is going up, and it's emerging as one of the most powerful countries in the world. Now let's talk about the military might, and if we cannot call United States of America as the sole superpower or unipolar world in terms of economics, but there's no doubt about their military might. The position of the US is unassailable in the military and political sphere. Everything related to the politics and military still revolves around America. So it's pretty much there. It's the politics, the dominancy, the affairs, the world affairs, the wars that are taking place, the role of policing by United States is still there. And American diplomatic power, political power and worldwide alliance networks are incomparable with other countries. America spends a lot of money on its diplomacy, its programs. It's all about how it deals in international circles. And despite the wars, despite the ongoing crisis, it still has maintained its monopoly over the political power and worldwide alliances networks. And it's incomparable. And that's why it's believed to be one of the strongest countries in the world. And that's why when it comes to military might, this is why military and politically, the world is unipolar. That's what experts believe that since militarily and politically, uh, the world is unipolar because of its strengths. And then there's economic factor. Uh, in the economic sense, however, the world is already multipolar, and the USA, China, and European Union are different poles of this economic universe. And we can see that each has an important area. They are even conducting businesses among themselves. So it's a tricky. It's like dancing with the devil. Despite the rivalry, they are doing businesses. They have combined strategic interests despite rivalries. And one of the example is that China is a leading exporter to United States. That explains. Despite the rivalry, despite the rising economics, the rivalry is there, but still they're exporting. They're having strategic partnerships. That explains the complex game of economics in the world. And then there are limitations. Another limitation is globalization. That globalization has led to an interconnected international systems, and although the US dominates world politics, it cannot do so without the consent of other international players. For example, for going to war, it needed some nod from the British United Kingdom and other countries and the European countries. So they had to also work on the public image of going to war. Although they had the military might, but still the world has changed, the politics are changing, globalization has changed the face of this earth. So they needed consent of other international players as well. And today, the United States has experienced an increasing emergence of its limitation of power throughout the world. And not only the economic crisis and China's rising economy, but also Russians' rising influences there economically. And Russia is emerging again as its economy is recovering, and that also poses threat. So China and Russia pose an economic threat to United States of America again. So it means that unipolarity is also subjective. It can change with time. The world can become multipolar. The world can become bipolar again. So it all depends on geopolitical circumstances, how and the world reacts and responds to these current circumstances. But obviously, economics play a key role. Economics, everything depends on it, and obviously, military advancement is also a key factor. We are going to talk about balance of power. Why balance of power is important? That because without balance of power, there will be lawlessness, there will be policing, and only one country will be dominating affairs, believing what it's doing is right. So balance of power is important for the global peace and security. There are numerous other international actors alongside you and even in opposition to you. So the balance of power is an important concept, and you must understand and effectively utilized for your country to be successful. And the balance of power is a concept in international relations where the power of one or more states balances the power of one or more other states, the check and balances. And the idea is to create equilibrium of power that establishes a stable international environment. So that's the key. How balance of power is important because if there's going to be one country, there's going to be monopoly, there's going to be exploitation, it's going to be the only country that dominates and believes that only their values are to be the best ones. So, in order, in other words, one can say the balance of power is necessary to keep checks on each other for global peace and security. It's an important idea that we need to talk about. So, what are the key points? That key points are that United States emerged as a sole superpower after the disintegration of Soviet Union, and the balance of power changes with economic and military might. As I said, the two important points are economy and military might. Military equipments and how powerful your army is, that also matters a lot when defining and explaining the unipolarity and bipolarity of the world. Economics play a key role. So these are the important points. And we must also not forget that some emerging economies can pose a great threat to the current polarity of the world. We must not ignore the rising economies, how the global face of trade and all those agreements are changing. Globalization is another important element, is contributing towards the polarity of the world. How technology shapes the relationship between the two countries. These are other key points. But importantly, we must not forget in the last 30 years after the disintegration of Soviet Union, we can clearly say that yes, United States dominate the world politics and military, and because of that, it's dominating the international relations circle. It's one of the most important countries that countries look forward to, and definitely uh, the blocks. There are no two camps to go. Obviously, the relationship with America and other countries is seen as significant in terms of collaborations and investments. But as we talk, the balance of power is necessary. Checks and balances keeps the world's security in check, and it's important that way. Otherwise, there will be one country with extreme powers, and it can do whatever it wants. It will be continue doing its policing. So let's see how the circumstances change. But anyway, nothing is static. The world politics will change. There's also a debate about the multipolarity. We've already discussed the three major global stakeholders: the United States of America, the Chinese investments in the world, and the European Union. And now we are also hearing about the recovery of Soviet economy. So all these circumstances are going to play an important role in how things goes in the near future and how people respond to it. So these are some of the references, and before we end our session, you can think about some of the important questions: that are we living in a unipolar world today? If we are living in a unipolar world, what are those determinants or what are those key elements that defines that we are living in a unipolar world? Is it economics? Is it military might? Is it investments? Is it having cordial relations? What makes a country unipolar, or how the unipolarity came into existence in the recent few decades? And apart from that, how do you see Pakistan's role in the emergence of bipolar world, or you can say multipolar world? Do you think there's a need for checks and balances, or do you think that unipolar world is much safer for the peace and security of the world? So these are some of the questions that you can look into even more. You can watch even. I would recommend a very good documentary towards the end, if you can watch it. Commanding Heights of Economy. It's a very good documentary that will give you a very wide perspective of two ideologies. Basically, the documentary focuses on the rise of communism and capitalistic economies. It compares both the economies, but it explains and gives you a context of Cold War. So the Cold War, which was nearly held for 5 decades or 50 years or half a century, it really changed the shape of our world because both countries, the Russians and Americans, were fighting for their military might, the space explorations, the nuclear arsenals. So the world was changing. There was a grave threat to the world's security. But after the fall of Berlin Wall and the collapse of Soviet Union Empire, everything changed. So you can look into that documentary to understand the how the economies work, how a dollar became so powerful. These are all the elements that you can think about. It will help you in understanding this unipolar and bipolar world. So I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you very much for being here today. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much.